In the face of perpetual defeat, Emperor Guangxu attempted to expand his predecessor's reforms by instituting the Hundred Days Reforms, which modernized the education system by rescinding the imperial examination system and creating a Western-style system of universities, including the establishing of Peking University. He looked to transform the system of government from that of an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one and encourage commerce through the adoption of a capitalist principle model. His aunt, Empress Dowager Cixi, who had largely let Guangxu govern independently up until this point, decided that his reforms were too radical, and in 1898 she seized power in a coup and placed Guangxu under house arrest for the remainder of his life, where he would spend his time fiddling with clocks, an obsession of his since his childhood. On the German-controlled Shandong Peninsula, widespread drought and famine persisted, with the local peasant farmers blamed on the German occupiers and their Christian missionaries. A secret group of peasants named the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists formed to resist foreign influence plaguing northern China, and their anger spread to any Chinese followers of Christianity, who they would round up, kill, and seize their property. The atrocities of the group against the Christians quickly became headline news in Western nations, who began referring to them as boxers to signify their prominent use of martial arts in their training and propaganda. The Boxers forced the Chinese Christian minorities to flee to Beijing, besieging them in the Forbidden City. Seeing the plight of the Chinese Christians, an eight-nation alliance formed consisting of Japan, Russia, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, who in total sent an invasion force of 45,000 soldiers, who arrived in Beijing in 1900 to relieve the siege. Empress Dowager Cixi, who had initially remained neutral, decided to support the Boxer Rebellion and declared war against the invading eight-nation alliance. The approaching Allied army forced the Empress Dowager and Emperor Guangxu to flee Beijing, where it fell to foreign powers by 1901. The rebellion came to an end with the signing of the Boxer Protocol, the last of the unequal treaties, which forced the Qing to pay the Western powers an annual tribute based on their proportion of the invading force provided, as well as the dismantling of all defensive positions guarding Tianjin and the foreign occupation of the legation quarter of Beijing. On her deathbed, Empress Dowager Cixi feared that Guangxu would try and pass his reforms the instant she passed, so she had him poisoned with arsenic, killing him in 1908 and replacing him with his nephew Puyi, although she would die just a day later from her terminal illness. Emperor Puyi ascended to the throne at the mere age of 2. Although he was a descendant of the imperial family, his own family lived as commoners, and little Puyi did not understand why he was being separated from his mother and father to go live in a faraway place. None of his family members were allowed to join him, with his only familiar companion being his wet nurse, Wang Lianchao, who, for all intents and purposes, would serve as his mother for the next 6 years. To Puyi's dismay, Wang Lianchao was sent away when he was 8 at the orders of a group of autocratic concubines and eunuchs who served as his regency, with claims that he was too old to be breastfeeding. Puyi would eventually meet his biological family when he was 13, but he felt very little connection to them, and they did not treat him like their son, but rather a godlike figure. The child emperor was incredibly spoiled and had his eunuch servants wait on his every whim, going as far as to blow on his soup when it was too hot. While the eunuchs doted on Puyi, they also took advantage of his young age and took part in widespread theft of imperial treasures from the Forbidden City, which the eunuchs would turn around and sell on the black market. In response, Puyi began to despise the eunuchs and would sadistically order them to be randomly beaten to satisfy his anger. Unknown to Puyi, forces were beginning to organize within China who looked to overthrow him. A secret society named Tang Menghui was formed by former Qing officials who were disillusioned with the failure of the Hundred Days Reform following the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1911, the provincial government of Sichuan was constructing a railroad to connect the cities of Chengdu and Wuhan, but was far behind schedule. The Qing government decided to instead open up the project to foreign investors in hopes that they could complete the project quicker. Mass protests formed in Sichuan against the selling of Chinese infrastructure assets to foreign buyers that became known as the Railway Protection Movement, and the Qing were forced to send troops from nearby provinces to contain the protests. The diversion of troops away from nearby Hubei province allowed elements of the new army, the westernized replacement following the previous reforms of the Green Standard Army, became radicalized with Tang Menghui teachings and started the Wuchang Uprising, capturing the provincial capital of Wuhan. This uprising would quickly reverberate across China, beginning the larger Xinhai Revolution. In 1912, the revolutionaries proclaimed the end of the Qing dynasty and ordered Emperor Puyi to abdicate and founded the Provisional Government of the Republic of China under the leadership of revolutionary Sun Yat-sen, using a five-colored flag to represent the five main ethnicities of China. Powerful general Yuan Shikai would break his forces away from the new army and form his own fighting force called the Beiyang Army. After some minor skirmishes, Sun Yat-sen agreed to hand power over to the Beiyang Army, beginning the Beiyang government, making Yuan Shikai the new president. Sun Yat-sen was then exiled to Japan, where he began a new revolutionary group known as the Kuomintang, with the goal of now overthrowing the Beiyang government. By 1915, high off his own power, Yuan Shikai aimed to consolidate his control more and proclaimed himself emperor of his new empire of China. Yuan Shikai's declaration of emperor sent shockwaves across China, with citizens rising up, quickly beginning the so-called National Protection War to oppose Yuan Shikai's power grab. The reaction was strong and swift and forced Yuan Shikai to abandon his monarchical ambitions. He died a couple months later from kidney failure, with Li Yuanhong being chosen as the next president. While the Beiyang government was restored, it was severely weakened, and control over Chinese territories began to fall into the hands of powerful provincial warlords, beginning the so-called warlord era. In this way, the Beiyang government was a simple republic with power resting in the hands of a parliament and represented by a presidential figurehead. Each powerful warlord would gain representation in the parliament by forming a clique, which would be similar to a political party today in modern US politics. By 1917, World War I was raging in Europe, and the Beiyang government was unsure on how to contribute. President Li Yuanhong and his administration were more inclined to support Germany, while the parliament led by warlord Duan Qirui was able to pass legislation breaking ties with Germany and publicly supporting the Allies against Li Yuanhong's wishes. When it became public that Japan, who was one of the Allies, had improperly given loans to Duan Qirui in exchange for favorable treatment, he was fired from his post. Angered, Duan Qirui fled south to Tianjin and set up his own resistance government. To the dismay of Yuan Hong, many of the soldiers of the Beiyang army supported Duan Qirui, and he had to ask for backup support from retired General Zhang Shun. With the support of modern weaponry gifted by the Germans, Zhang Shun was able to defeat Duan Qirui, but then shocked the president by continuing on to Beijing to seize the capital and restore Emperor Puyi to the throne in the Manchu Restoration. Facing disaster, Li Yuanhong had no other choice but to reinstate Duan Qirui to his position and request his assistance in defeating Zhang Shun. Within 2 weeks, the restoration had been reversed, and Puyi was again relegated to a solitary life in the Forbidden City. This same year, Sun Yat-sen would return from Japan and settle in Guangzhou, setting up his own rival government called the Constitutional Protection Movement, which would be jointly controlled by the old Guangxi clique and the Kuomintang, and would begin to actively oppose the Beiyang government. Humiliated from having to reinstate his former rival, Li Yuanhong resigned from the presidency and was followed by his vice president Fang Guozhang. The emboldened Duan Qirui was popular following his victory, with his followers forming the Anhui clique and his rivals coalescing around President Fang Guozhang and his Zili clique. During the 1918 elections, the Anhui clique seized power in a rigged election, capturing 75% of the vote, with the rest of the power being shared between the specialized communications clique made up of representatives of the railroad and telegraph industries and the research clique made up of intellectual progressives. One early provision of the Beiyang government was the placement of a 5-year term limit on the presidency. Because Fang Guozhang was merely finishing his predecessor's term, parliamentarian leader Duan Qirui selected Xu Shichuang as his successor. The following year, representatives from the Beiyang government were sent to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference as part of the negotiations following the end of World War I. Because China had ended up on the victorious side by nominally supporting the Allies through the deployment of militant labor forces, they had a say in what was done with the imperial German territories that had existed within China proper. When it became public that the Chinese ambassador was planning on ceding the Shandong Peninsula over to Japan, who had seized it from the Germans in a corrupt dealing, massive nationwide protests ensued, with the loudest protesters being university students. 3,000 students from across 13 universities in Beijing gathered and marched on Tiananmen Square, protesting the ceding of Shandong in what became known as the May 4th movement. The protests were a success, and President Xu Shichang and his administration were forced to walk back plans to sign the Treaty of Versailles and take back control of Shandong. As the Chinese soldiers who were deployed during the war were returning from Europe, Xu Shichang decided that instead of disbanding them, he would have them go on and invade Outer Mongolia and finally seize control from the Mongols. Unfortunately for the Chinese, the Mongols were supported by the powerful White Russian army, and they successfully repelled the Chinese invasion. The failed occupation of Outer Mongolia had the additional negative effect of angering the Fangshan clan, who controlled Manchuria and feared such a large fighting force near their territory. And in 1920, they allied with the Zili clique to remove Anhui influence from parliament, who they saw as incompetent, beginning the Zili-Anhui War, which consequently only lasted a couple of days, with the Zili and their Fangshan allies coming on top. This same year, bickering began between the old Guangxi clique and the Kuomintang, and who actually exerted control over Guangdong, with Sun Yat-sen and his Kuomintang being victorious in the Guangdong-Guangxi War, which saw the disbandment of the old Guangxi clique and its replacement with the new Guangxi clique, which was filled with Sun Yat-sen loyalists. Meanwhile, the Fangshan clique began to question the growing military dominance of their Zili allies. Although they were unsuccessful and the Fangshan were expelled and forced to retreat back to Manchuria. The Zili parliament was voted to remove President Xu Shichang from his position and reinstated former President Li Yuanhong. Li Yuanhong's second term was unsuccessful, and by 1923, the Zili clique was looking to a new choice for president, replacing him with Cao Kun, who instantly set out to reform the government by passing a new constitution. Cao Kun had notched the election win after significant controversy following his public promise to give $5,000 worth of silver to any member of parliament who agreed to vote for him. Despite him becoming president, very few people wanted to be associated with Cao Kun's corrupt administration, and he had major issues finding imperial staff. In 1924, the Zili clique demanded control of the important port city of Shanghai be handed over to them, which was controlled by the last remnants of the Anhui clique. The Anhui refused and again appealed to the Fangshan and the Kuomintang for support, beginning the Second Zili-Fangshan War. Following the ensuing fighting, it seemed that the Zili would once again be victorious. However, a major surprise occurred in October of that year when Zili Army General Fang Yuxiang betrayed the clique and captured President Cao Kun, deposing him and placing him under house arrest in what became known as the Beijing coup, which allowed the Fangshan clique to seize power from the Zili. The Fangshan were much more conservative than the Zili, so it was unsurprising that they invalidated the new constitution, and their geographic origin of Manchuria meant that they were more closely aligned with Japanese interests. Huang Fu was briefly chosen as the next president, but was replaced with General Duan Qirui only after a month. Duan Qirui and Generals Fang Yuxiang and Zhang Zuolin and called Sun Yat-sen to Forbidden City to discuss the reunification of a united China and the dissolution of all rival cliques. But Sun Yat-sen unfortunately died from liver cancer before the talks could meet a resolution. Following Sun Yat-sen's death, a power struggle over who should lead the Kuomintang, also now going by the alternative name the Chinese Nationalist Party, began pitting the existing new Guangxi clique leadership against challengers from the nearby Yunnan clique, beginning the Yunnan-Guangxi War, with the new Guangxi forces reorganizing as the National Revolutionary Army under the control of the previously obscure General Chiang Kai-shek, who was the protege of Sun Yat-sen, with the National Revolutionary Army winning and cementing their control over the Kuomintang, in part by allying with elements of the local Communist Party in a partnership called the First United Front. Internal bickering among Fangshan leadership caused General Fang Yuxiang to leave the clique and form the Kuomintang, also known as the People's Army. The Fangshan continued to be supported by Japan, who preferred to see China return to the monarchy form of government, which they viewed as more stable, while the Kuomintang, while not communists themselves, were supported by the new Soviet Union and had more socialist tendencies due to the fact they were largely made up of soldiers from the poor Manchuria region of northeastern China. In 1925, Kuomintang forces attacked and besieged the Fengtian capital of Mukden, beginning the anti-Fengtian War. Guomindang attacks on a Japanese warship that was assisting the Fengtian was seen as a violation of the Boxer Protocol, and the Japanese demanded immediate deconstruction of all defensive positions guarding Tianjin as previously agreed upon. This demand caused massive nationwide student protests to erupt again with demands to end the unequal treaties. Duan Chirui, fearing the unrest, violently dispelled the protesters, killing 47 students in what became known as the March 18th massacre. The optics of the situation were so bad that Duan Chirui was forced to step down and was replaced with interim president Hu Weidi, who had been a prominent Qing diplomat. The Fengtian then subsequently defeated and dismantled the Kuomintang. Meanwhile, in Guangzhou, the First United Front began to splinter as General Chiang Kai-shek began to suspect his communist allies of plotting with the Soviets to seize control of the Kuomintang. So he instigated the Canton coup by seizing the nationalist warship, the Zhongshan, and its treasonous communist captain and Kuomintang leader Wang Jingwei, who was consequently placed on house arrest and replaced by Chiang Kai-shek himself. Unsure on who should be president long term, Hu Weidi resigned after a month and was followed by Yan Huiqing, who also only lasted a month before being followed by Du Shigui. At this point in July 1926, an emboldened Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek launched the Northern Expedition military campaign to unify China under the control of a strong nationalist government to replace the Beiyang government, which he saw as a weak republic. In response, Du Shigui stepped down as president and was replaced by Wellington Koo, who formed the National Pacification Army to defend Beijing and Fengtian lands from the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang's march north was swift, with them already controlling the key southern cities of Guangzhou, Changsha, Nanchang, Fuzhou, Hangzhou, Wuhan, and Shanghai by March 1927, and actively laying siege to Nanjing. The retreating Beiyang forces began looting property, including that of foreigners, given that Nanjing was home to a large foreigner population at the time. British and American vessels stationed at Nanjing responded to reports of their citizens being robbed by opening fire on the city, killing a number of civilians, and causing further rioting and looting amongst the locals. In the aftermath of the siege, Chiang Kai-shek believed that a large portion of the looting was caused by communist instigators, and in response, he ordered the massacre of 8,000 communist sympathizers in Shanghai in April of that year. The shock of the atrocity led Kuomintang official Eugene Chen to free Wang Jingwei from house arrest, who then subsequently declared the schism of the Kuomintang, forming the Wuhan nationalist government in Wuhan, separate from the Chiang Kai-shek's leadership in Nanjing. In July, the Wuhan nationalist government had their own purge when Wang Jingwei expelled all suspected communists from his administration as a sign of goodwill. Chiang Kai-shek reciprocated this by agreeing to step down as leader of the Kuomintang and to self-exile to Japan, allowing the nationalists to mend their differences and reunify.